why don't presidential candidates visit North Dakota? No offense to North Dakota, and I'm sure the presidential candidates don't want to offend them, but there is a reason why they don't visit North Dakota. And in this lecture, I want to talk about the Electoral College. Certainly a unique system, a unique mode of electing anybody to office, but a strange one too. And I hope, though, that in this lecture, I can help you understand the machinations, the mechanics of the Electoral College, but also maybe suggest how other fundamental constitutional principles can be seen in the working of the Electoral College. Though at the end of the lecture, I want to suggest that there might be a little bit of a tainted history to the college itself. This is what James Madison said in Federalist number 68 in the Federalist Papers about the Electoral College. He said, "The mode of appointment of the Chief Magistrate of the United States is almost the only part of the system of any consequence which has escaped without severe censure, or which has received the slightest mark of approbation from its opponents. I would venture somewhat further," Madison went on to say, "and hesitate not to affirm that if the manner of it be not perfect, it is at least excellent. It unites in an eminent degree all the advantages of the Union which were to be wished for." So at least Madison claims in the Federalist Papers, which we always have to take a close look at because they were editorials written in New York newspapers to convince delegates to the New York State ratifying convention to accept the Constitution. But Madison suggests that the structure of the Electoral College during the convention didn't really receive a lot of censure. In other words, there wasn't a lot of disagreement about choosing this mode of election, this kind of operation for the selection of our chief executive. So one thing that we need to understand about the Electoral College from the perspective of those who were framing it, that aside from the fact that they mostly agreed that this was a very good system, they had significant concerns about the nature of the executive branch itself, significant concerns about the presidency that the Electoral College represents. In other words, the Electoral College, in the framers' mind, was designed to produce a winner, a president, that would have a certain quality to him, right? That was unique to the executive branch, which while they absolutely supported because they created the executive branch during the convention, were worried about. And it's understandable that they would be worried about the executive branch. When you look at your little pocket copies of the Constitution, you see that right after the preamble, we have the first article. The first thing that you would see is like a sheer genius, marketing genius, the geniuses the founders were. The first thing you see is the People's Branch, Congress, and all of the rules and procedures that create and constitute Congress. You don't see first the executive. Why would that be? Well, just a decade and a half before, we had fought a war, a revolutionary war against a monarchy. So to have a single executive was, to the anti-federalists especially, something that was very worrisome. And you don't see it first in the Constitution. When you look at it, that's not the first thing you see. So again, they weren't against an executive. The founders thought one was absolutely necessary, and a single one at that. There were proposals to have a committee of executives, but they decided against that. So there were concerns, though, that the executive could be monarchical, or that at the very least, we need to create a system for choosing our executive that was unique to the special concerns of the presidency itself, the kind of winner that we wanted. So again, there were two more concerns, though, aside from the concern, the more marketing-like concern about having people think that the executive branch was a monarchy. And that was to prevent corruption. In other words, to prevent not necessarily corruption in the executive branch, although that would certainly be, if we produced the right choice, the odds of corruption would go down. But they meant corruption in the selection of the executive himself. So, and this is what Madison said about the Electoral College being able to prevent this. He said, "Nothing was more to be desired than that every practicable obstacle should be opposed to cabal, intrigue, and corruption." Right? So whatever kind of system we would have, we want to prevent cabal, intrigue and corruption. He went on to say, these most deadly adversaries of Republican government might naturally have been expected to make their approaches from more than one corner, but chiefly from the desire in foreign powers to gain an improper ascendant in our councils. So another concern of the founders about the executive branch that the Electoral College is designed to cure is foreign intrigue or foreign cabals getting involved in the selection of our chief executive. So the Electoral College is going to be designed, as I'll talk about in a minute, to try to prevent that from happening. The other concern, though, as I said before, if you look at the Constitution as a potential consumer, as a potential voter, yes or no, am I going to accept this thing? The first thing you see is not the executive branch. That would have scared people. It's the people's branch. So, but nevertheless, if we're going to avoid cabal and intrigue, we're going to have a unique system for choosing our chief executive. But no system would be legitimate. No system would be authoritative if it did not have some kind of democratic feature to it. So this is what the founders were thinking about. So again, they were worried about corruption and intrigue in the selection of the executive. They wanted to produce a certain kind of executive, right? Create a voting system that produced a certain kind of executive. But they also, thirdly, they wanted this choice to be as democratic as possible. Not completely democratic, but as democratically as possible, considering these concerns. So what did we come up with? The Electoral College. As you all know, hopefully, the Electoral College is this system that we have that selects the president. When you actually go to the polls, as I'll talk about, you do not vote for the president and the vice president. Nobody votes. Nobody in here, I bet, has ever voted for the president or the vice president. You vote for a slate of electors that are pledged to vote for the president and the vice president. I'll talk about that in a second. But the way the college works is this way. Every state gets a certain amount of electoral votes, and candidates compete to win a majority of those votes across the nation. Now, how does we come up with a number for each state for the amount of votes that they have? Well, we say, remember, one of the concerns here was to have it as democratic as possible. Well, by this point in the convention, we could look at the work that had been done already and say, well, we already have a democratic branch. It's Congress. Well, how about we use Congress as the model for assigning electoral votes? And that is still the case today. Each state gets a number of electoral votes that are exactly equal to their representation in Congress. Every state has at least 2 votes because every state has 2 senators. But representation in the House varies with population. The more population you have, California has a huge amount of House members. So you take your amount of House members, add that to that 2, that permanent 2, and that's the amount of electoral votes each state gets. Now, to win the presidency, to win the Electoral College, you need, as a candidate, to have a majority, to win a majority of those electoral votes. If you do not win a majority of those electoral votes, if you have less than a majority, or there's a tie in the Electoral College, the founders imagined this to happen, and in fact it did happen, then there's a provision in the Constitution that says that the selection of the president then goes to the House of Representatives, which is the most democratic of the 2 branches of Congress. Remember, at this time, we did not directly elect our senators. So again, here's the founders coming up with a unique system to prevent a certain kind of, or to produce a certain kind of candidate or winner, but still at the same time trying to make it as democratic as possible. Well, if we throw it into the House, some said, well, then the bigger states would have more of an opportunity to win the election, or to swing the election, or to choose the winner. So what the founders did instead was, yes, the selection of the presidency of the president will go to the House of Representatives, but each state will vote as a delegation. So no matter how many representatives Virginia had at the time, they would vote among themselves, and there would be one choice. So Virginia would only get 1 vote, not 13. Rhode Island, if it only had 1 House member, would still get 1 vote. So it equalizes, it makes equal the states in the House, which is not an equal institution. the House is unequal, right? The bigger your state is, the more representation you have in it. But here in this unique case of the Electoral College, states are equal in the selection of the president if there's a tie or nobody gets a majority. But there's another aspect of the Electoral College which is probably the most controversial and which is probably the scariest when we think about it, although there have never been any of these incidents, as I'll talk about, that have ever swayed an election. There's another aspect of the Electoral College, though, that we need to talk about, and that is the electors themselves. Like I said before, when you go to vote for president, as you'll do this November, look closely at your ballot. It will say, if you're going to vote for Obama and Biden, it will say, check here. Here in Oklahoma, we use a pen and color in the box, or fill in the line. Fill in this line, check here, to vote for the electors for Barack Obama and Joseph Biden. You are not directly voting for Obama and Biden. You are voting for a slate of electors who will decide if your vote was the right one. Where does this come from? Well, the founders said, or Madison said, in justifying this, that we need to have an intermediate body of people, in a sense, to check our votes. Remember, one of the big concerns here was foreign influence. Another one was what Madison called the little arts of popularity. Madison said we should be concerned to get rid of the little arts of popularity. And how could we do that? Well, we can imagine us all being swayed by a great campaign, right? We can all imagine that. And we're swayed and we're moved and we show up and we vote. And then we say, oh my, I don't think that was the right idea. Now that I reflect on this, I don't think it was a great idea. That is the idea of the electors themselves, to be an intermediate body. And the founders had in mind that this intermediate body would be chosen for this very specific purpose and no other purpose. They were what Madison called a transitory body of people, selected for this very important purpose. Right? Prominent figures in the community, people that the community or the state trusted for this awesome responsibility, which was to have, in a sense, this time period between an election and the day that the electors meet in their own states to certify the amount of votes that a candidate has won. And again, the idea here is to check the people's wishes and desires for the president. And you can imagine, for such an awesome choice, for a singular executive, and we've seen in our lifetimes and in the history of the United States the increased power that the executive branch has over our lives and in the world, we can see how this was and still is a legitimate concern that our system produce the right outcome. In other words, the right kind of person for the office. And again, we can see in the structure of the Electoral College this very concern. Now, the electors themselves sometimes have not been what we call faithful. There have been faithless electors. And that's really problematic if you think about it. But it isn't if you think about it in the way that the founders had in mind, which was to check kind of the momentary passions of the people, to make sure that there's a cooling off period, in a sense, after the election, that we weren't swayed or moved by something that we shouldn't have been. Now, the way that the Electoral College works today, though, is a little different. Some states by now have passed laws that their electors can't be faithless. So electors have to vote in the way that if this slate of electors wins, in other words, if Obama wins Oklahoma, which is not going to happen, then those, not for any other reason than he just won't, I know he won't, those electors might be bound by law. And I'm not sure if Oklahoma passed a law about electors. I'd have to look at that. But other states, some states do not have a law that requires their electors to vote that way. Today, though, the vast majority of electors are party volunteers, lots of retirees, people who've worked in the party with party leadership, have helped raise money, helped get out the vote. But you can imagine that they would be faithful. I mean, if they're Democrats and the Democrat wins, they're going to cast their electoral votes for the Democrat. So the system doesn't have as much teeth, or potentially doesn't have as much teeth and bite as the framers imagined. But we can still see in our strange system called the Electoral College some fundamental concerns about the executive branch itself, and kind of this unique American way of thinking about designing institutions in such a way that produce certain kinds of outcomes or certain kinds of people. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from Woody Young and the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.